Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first in our series of virtual online seminars. There will be a series of 5 seminars coming up over the next few weeks, each including a whole host of different museums from across the United Kingdom, looking at some very exciting projects, exhibitions, approaches to working that have been going on across the country, particularly focusing on decolonisation and democratisation. At the end of the series, we'll have a really exciting, huge group discussion, inviting everyone back who has been involved to discuss the wider themes around decolonisation and democratisation. And hopefully it'll inspire a lot of other people who are watching to kind of go off and do similar projects and similar work, working with our local communities to ensure our museums become spaces that we are kind of welcoming and doing necessary work that we all know, especially given the kind of news going on today and across the world. There is constant need for change like this in our museums and much wider. But we're starting off with 2 incredible human beings, people who have been doing some fascinating and really important work in museums and heritage organisations across the country. We are starting off with Subhadra Das. Subhadra, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
If I can get the technology to work, I happily will. Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. My name is Subhadra Das. I am curator of the science collections at University College London. For the purposes of this conference, I am a South Asian woman working in a predominantly white institution. More on that to follow.
And we also have Liam Wiseman joining us today. So Liam, would you like to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I'm Liam Wiseman. I'm a Museum Relationship Manager at Arts Council England. My role covers the east of England, so that's where I'm based. And again, like Subhadra said, I'm not really speaking as an Arts Council person today. I'm speaking as a Black man that works in museums and with museums, trying to encourage them to be better.
Brilliant. So, everyone who's watching, you have the opportunity to put any questions you might have throughout this first session into the YouTube comments page. We can also share questions on Twitter. The hashtag is #CultureDND. If you look for our Twitter, at COL Museums, so that's at Col Museums. You can also share any of your questions on there. There will be people monitoring those and feeding those through to us. But what we will do is we'll wait until after both of our speakers have presented before we tackle any of those questions. So without further ado, I would like to ask Subhadra to start her presentation.
Thanks very much, Ben. It's an interesting moment to be talking to all of you. And I'm well aware that the challenge of speaking to a professional museum sector audience is even greater given the time and space in which this is happening. So I'm mindful of the fact that, and I'm grateful for the fact that you're all here and listening, but I'm also mindful of the fact that your mind might be somewhere else with some various political things that are happening at the moment. This talk is not going to shy away from any of those in particular. So if anyone is in need of a trigger warning about the current US elections, this is it. But altogether, to put it mildly, we are in the midst of a difficult time. Lots of museums in the UK are in a position of threat. There are a lot of people who are working in museums today that are at risk of losing their jobs. And what's not helping, although I imagine that what they are trying to do is to help, what is not helping is that there are leaders of national museums holding firm to what they think appears to be the middle ground. Both the director of the Science Museum, Ian Blatchford, and also the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, Tristram Hunt, have written and been published in major newspapers in the last couple of months, talking about things along the lines of it is not the job of museums to censor history, it is the role of museums to be neutral in the set of a political context. We've even seen the BBC take a stance in terms of what I would call censoring the people that work for them in terms of what they are and are not allowed to put on social media. Although you will be relieved to hear that the international season of every single news reader and every guest who appears on a news programme is wearing a poppy. And I should say that I'm certainly not anti the poppy appeal. I wear a poppy every year, particularly to remember the 2 million Indian men and women who served during World War I and World War II under the banner of the British Empire. I just want to point out that it's clearly the case that some causes have political sanction while others don't. And we should be concerned about who gets to say which is which. Museum leaders like Hunt and Blatchford, who continue to claim false neutrality in an expedient political interest, need to be more ashamed of what they are doing. It is bad enough that they have held this clearly activist political stance themselves for many years, but to do so at a moment when a real cultural change that is in favour of greater inclusion is possible seems to me to be pretty hideous cultural leadership. They are the kind of cultural leaders that we can do without. Because guess what? Changing a few labels in museums is not the same thing as museum activism. It only looks like it when all you are interested in doing is maintaining museums in a colonial status quo. And I'm pleased to be able to report to you that it turns out that their days may well be numbered, because for once they are not the only story in town. The Natural History Museum in London announced in September that they would be taking a dedicated look at the colonial contexts and histories of their museum collections. They were following in the footsteps of the National Trust, who had made a similar announcement at the end of August, and at the end of September published an interim document about their report on how a third of their properties have direct links to slavery and colonialism. The other 2/3, of course, have indirect links. And even as recently as last week, Lucy Worsley, who's the chief curator of Royal Historic Palaces, followed suit, saying that this work was long overdue. The time has come, she said. We're behind and we haven't done well enough. Here is hoping that she carries some of that attitude across to her BBC programming. These institutions have come in for a lot of public criticism from racists and from other people. And they are probably due a lot more, but I hope that they hold their course. If it seems that my faith in this is somewhat ambivalent, it's because that's exactly what it is. Because if we go back to each of those examples, over the summer when the NHM made their announcement, I got a couple of notes of congratulations from people saying, you must be very happy about this, because they felt that some of that change might be down to an article that I co-authored with Principal Curator at the Natural History Museum, Miranda Lowe, about decolonial approaches to the Natural History Museum. And I do appreciate the thought, and I do think that Miranda and I have made a contribution to the sector that is useful, I hope. But the history books would be wrong if they cite this one academic paper as the reason for the change, in the face of Miranda's 30-year career at the Natural History Museum, doing not only exemplary scientific research and curation, but also drawing attention to the colonial histories and contexts of the collections there, and telling the stories of people of colour that had otherwise been neglected. They'd also not be giving appropriate notice to the expediency, again, of a political moment, that these changes are very clearly the result and in line with the public outcry and reaction to the murder of George Floyd by police officers in the United States this summer. And I kind of share a same feeling, because in the aftermath of that very public murder, UCL finally took the names of a couple of eugenicists off of their buildings. And again, I got lots of notes of congratulations saying, you must be very happy that the exhibition that you curated about the history of eugenics at UCL was instrumental in this change. And I just don't feel like that's the case. I feel, again, like this is well, for one thing, I was on furlough at the time, which is interesting in terms of just how the timing of that worked out. But I just feel like these are reactionary moves in the face of, and the history of, particularly at UCL, pretty much 10 years worth of activism from both students and staff saying that the names of those buildings should be changed. If change only comes in the flash of a political moment, how can we be sure that it is change at all? I would be more convinced were it not for a feeling that this is all for show. For me, the abiding lesson of the summer protests and heritage isn't about the statue of Edward Colston that ended up in Bristol Harbour, as cathartic and an amazing an event as that was. It's the fact that the Museum of Docklands took down the statue of Robert Milligan immediately afterwards, and their timing stunk. To me, the message was, we are not taking the statue down because for years people have been telling us and complaining about it. It is, let's get this out of the way before it ends up in the Thames. Which at least was a slightly more positive move than what the Museum of the Home decided to do when they didn't take down the contentious statue that they have. They decided to keep it in place because their money was at risk. The money is important. Of course, the money is important. The other headlines this summer about the National Trust are about its massive restructure and about the people who are going to lose their jobs there. Also about the Tate and just how appallingly they are treating the people that are working for them. How are we expected to do the right thing if our job means putting our jobs on the line? I expect Ian Blatchford and Tristram Hunt are playing a long game, ensuring the government does not see them as troublemakers and that their national museums continue to have privileged access to national funds. But here's the thing. If all you care about is what the Daily Mail says, then I hope you do lose your museum job because you are not helping us. Right now, when it has become patently clear that the people who really do the important work in our society are the people who work in hospitals, the people who work in supermarkets, the people who work in funeral homes, why are you even interested in keeping the old colonial museum going? How is it serving you? How is it serving the others in your community? How many Black people do you need to watch be murdered in the street before you feel that our society is unjust to its very core and that we need to do something about it? Sorry, that was more than I was expecting it to be. Excuse me. This isn't even activism. The idea that we can change a few labels and do a bit of history and be a curatorial solution to the problem of museums is not even close to activism. We need only to look across the water to the work that the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side of Manhattan did in 2017, when it was actively raising funds for the people of Puerto Rico, when I can hopefully call him the then President, Donald Trump, all that he could do was to go across, make a trip, throw some toilet roll around the place and think that that was useful. We heard from the Museums Association conference in 2018 from Laura Rykovich, who was then the director of the Queen's Museum in New York City, talking about her response to the result of the 2016 election, where she turned her museum into an activist space, confronting the threats of Trump's administration, particularly with regard to immigration policies and how those would directly affect the people in her community and her neighborhood. She set up the space in order to be able to host people who were organizing protests. Your museum and cultural activism needn't even necessarily be so overtly political. I want to give a shout out to one of the organizers of this particular session of Decolonisation and Democratisation, Eleanor Root, whose prize-winning work over the summer involved getting together resources from the museums to put together school packs. She inconveniently did not pin that at the top of her Twitter profile, so I'm not able to give you exactly the details of that, but it was extraordinary work in very trying circumstances. I know that we are all suffering. I know that even that even though I exist in a position of extreme middle-class privilege, the fact that I am able to work from home, and the fact that a lockdown, even a second lockdown that we're going into, is not fundamentally changing any of the ways in which I'm going to be working, or certainly have been working for the last 6 months. That doesn't mean that we're not all going through difficult times regardless of our privilege. It just means we are all going through difficult times in very different ways. And there may seem as though there is an expediency involved in being able to say decolonisation is not a key priority for museums at the moment. We've got too much else to worry about in terms of simply being able to keep our doors open and being able to keep our people employed. And I appreciate that stress and I appreciate that concern. But if all we do in this scenario is to say that decolonisation is an important thing, but for the moment it's suspended because we can't afford to do it or because our priorities need to be elsewhere, that is simply putting Black and brown people in this country back into a box. And it's saying, this is your special minority interest. We thought we were going to give you a bit of a platform for a moment, but it turns out we've got other things involved. Be good citizens and don't make too much of a fuss. I don't feel like that's helpful, although you can probably tell from the tone of my voice that I'm resigned to the fact that that might well be the way that it is. I wanted to finish on what I hope is both an optimistic and trying to be inspiring, and I'm trying to inspire myself as I'm going along with this, which is that referring to the work of a friend of mine, Becky Clark, who is the Director of Churches for the Church of England, Becky talks about an idea called cathedral thinking. And I should say that I admire Becky for a number of reasons, not least because she's a remarkably intelligent, warm, compassionate and kind person, as quite a lot of the people that work in the church are. And I hugely respect the work that the church is doing in terms of understanding that their priority should be their communities. The idea of cathedral thinking is that you can start to build the foundations of a building, knowing that you yourself as an individual will never be able to see the finished product, but you know that future generations might. And this is the really important thing about what those of us who are trying to advocate for decolonisation of museums are trying to do, or at least it's very much what my position is, which is that change is possible. We understand that it can be slow, that it can be gradual, but change is possible, and change is something that we need to do. Even if it's the case that we put those foundations in place without ever being able to see the real results of it for ourselves. And I wanted to finish on a cautionary tale, which is a story from history, which is the story of Emmeline Pankhurst. Many of you will be familiar with her name. She is a feminist hero because she is the woman who won some women the vote. And her name was all through the headlines. I've lost track of time, last year. And the thing about Emmeline Pankhurst was she suspended her activism work when World War I came about, because what she believed was that the rights of women and the equality of people, as far as suffrage was concerned, was a lesser consideration than the work of the nation as a whole. I don't know if a lot of people know that story. I was surprised to hear that story about the woman who essentially took on terrorism as a means of gaining women the vote. And the reason why I wanted to highlight that story and also tell you that in the aftermath of the success of her campaign to get some women the vote, she went over to Canada and started to do activism work in terms of the Keep Canada White campaign. Now, it won't surprise anyone that historical figures, particularly from the turn of the century, will have racism and colonialism in the roots of what their activism was, and that their activism wasn't for everyone. We will call them a product of their time, although if they had enough foresight to be able to understand that some people should have equality, then it is interesting that they did not extend that courtesy to some of the rest of us. What I'm saying is sometimes the face of activism is not the thing that it looks like. And what I want to do is to draw your attention to the second word in the title of this conference, which is democratisation. Decolonisation is not a niche interest for Black and brown people working in the museum sector or working in higher education or in education more generally. It is about all of us, and it is about how all of us are creating the national history of the place where we live and the places in which we work. if you take nothing else away from this, take that away, which is that this is not simply a side subject. It's not something we need to be worried about having a particular budget for, although we will take all the budget you can give. It is the idea that we are all, through our individual actions, capable of change, even in the absence of leadership who don't necessarily do the things that we would want them to do. It's really difficult to know whether you've made a kind of a rousing talk when you can't actually see anyone, but that is what I wanted to say. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Subhadra. That was a very powerful talk, and I'm sure a lot of the topics and subjects that were covered will come up again in the discussions later on, and probably throughout this series. I know a lot of the time the feeling of almost powerlessness, or kind of what can we do as individuals, is something that kind of inhibits us to act in certain ways. But I will now move on to Liam. Liam will be talking as well, and then after that, keep the questions coming in if anyone has any questions, and then we'll cover them all at the end of this session. So Liam.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Subhadra. Subhadra's talk just then, I think it was, I don't know if I can swear, but I'm going to say she's fucking inspirational, because what she's highlighted is so relevant and so significant in this discussion. I want to start my session by just saying that I'm going to talk about decolonisation and some of the practical things you can do to encourage that. But I think it's important to highlight that I don't have all the answers, and I don't think anyone does at the moment. I don't think anyone ever will, because I feel like decolonisation is a process. It is a constant state of self-evaluation and self-reflection of your organisation and your staff and the people within it and the work you want to do. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach to this. It's appropriate for it's got to be appropriate for your museum, your institution, and your staff, and the people who live in your community. And the other thing is that, and I'm glad that Subhadra mentioned this as well, obviously the murder of George Floyd still on a lot of people's minds, and rightly so. And earlier this year, a lot of museums all across the world came out in support of anti-racism and the Black Lives Matter protests. And they put out statements that basically said, yeah, we're not racist, we don't want to be racist, we're going to try and not be. And if you're listening to this session and you either work with or you know one of the organizations that put out those statements, I want you to just ask yourself or ask the people that work there, what have your organizations done since then? Have you done anything to kind of further anti-racism within your organizations? Have you done anything to change the way that you work and the people that you work with? And if you have, and you've got something you want to bring up, please pop it in the chat. We'd really like to hear about it. Maybe we can hear some of those towards the end of the session. But for now, I've got a little presentation. It's just words. It's just mainly for me more than anyone else, but it's got some things that might be useful for people. So I'm going to share my screen. And I hope that, yeah, I hope that you can ignore the fact that I've got like a million tabs up, because I'm one of those people, unfortunately. Yeah, this is what I wanted to share. So it's about decolonisation. So this is what I think decolonisation is, and obviously it's something that means a lot of different things to different people. For me, decolonisation is about challenging racism within museums and wanting museums to be anti-racist. I feel like as museums and organisations that talk about British history, we need to be able to be critical and open about the issues of British history, to be aware of how our history has shaped our present, because there still seems to be an utter reluctance in this country to join the dots between what has happened in the past in terms of racism and how it affects people today. And it absolutely does. You can see the whole connection through that. I think that decolonisation should challenge organisational attitudes as much as offensive collections or offensive interpretation. It needs to negotiate existing problematic power structures and dismantle them ideally. And like I said, I think it's a process that won't be done overnight and needs to be continually revisited. I broke decolonisation down into kind of 3 strands, and I'm going to talk about them a bit individually. So first of all, kind of the visitor experience and the museum organisation itself. So as Subhadra mentioned in her session that as part of her work that she was doing, she was able to get the name of the eugenicists removed from the organisation that she worked for. I think that's so powerful and so underrated. The name of an organisation can tell you so much about that organisation, and whether or not the organisation means to. If you are a museum that is named after a person that either did or was indirectly responsible for horrific acts in their lifetime, that's not a good look. That's really not a good look for your museum. So I would certainly think one of the first things you should do is check, does the name of your museum, if it's named after a person, represent slave traders or eugenicists or notorious racists? And then thinking about the visitor experience for the museum. So are your front of house staff and volunteers treating all the visitors the same? Because I guarantee that they won't be in a lot of cases. I would love to believe that everyone is anti-racist that works in museums, but obviously that simply isn't true. And especially when it comes to front of house and visitor experience, that can change significantly depending on your skin color, depending on other aspects of your background. I have, in my experience, and I work with a lot of museums, I work with hundreds of museums across the east of England and even further. And in several of them, I have had pretty horrific experiences, with racism or being treated significantly differently to other people who walk through those doors. I've even seen it be so blatant as to walk into the museum behind a white person and have that white person get the whole spiel about the museum from the front of house staff, where they walk them through everything, talk them through everything, tell them all these lovely stories, and then I'll go up to the front desk and they barely make any contact with me. They just ask me to pay if I have to pay, or give me a ticket. Similarly, on your security, treating all visitors the same, and this is even more important. And I know most museums, because they'll be smaller, don't tend to have security. But obviously, if you don't have security, you might have gallery stewards or other volunteers or attendees that work there. And there is nothing that ruins a museum experience more than being eyeballed the whole time you're walking around. Sometimes I go to museums and I'm literally not able to actually focus on what I'm supposed to be looking at because I'm being checked out by security because of my color of my skin. So check that your security staff aren't racist. That's an important one. And then there are other questions about internally, does your museum as an organization consider itself to be anti-racist? Is the work that you're doing anti-racist? And if it is, how are you measuring that? Are you measuring that? Does your staff hierarchy allow for decision making at all levels? Is a really important one, because one of the things obviously that we're talking about, not just decolonization, but democratization. If decisions only ever get made at senior management level, and senior management across museums tends to be white, and there are statistics for that, and I can get into that, then that is absolutely not going to be representative of the people that might engage with the museum. And then finally, do you collect information on the diversity of your audiences? Because it's really important to know, if you want to be anti-racist, are you actually getting people of color coming into your organizations at all? And if not, why not? And if you are, how can you encourage that more? How can you capitalize on that? How can you build on that work? And then we move on to interpretation of collections. So obviously, one of the biggest challenges for museums, are your collections representative of people of color? And when I say that, I don't just mean, do you have objects that showcase racism? I think it's important to understand that there is a distinct difference between talking about racism within history and museums and having objects and items that represent that, as opposed to actually talking about the experiences of people of color within your museums. Is your interpretation accurate? Does it involve wider viewpoints than just white views? That's a really important one, because we know that most museums cater to the white European narrative, and history is so much wider than that. And this is a multicultural country, whether you like it or not. So you should be trying to include a variety of responses, ideas, opinions about history from people with different backgrounds. Do you collect items not belonging to white people, and do you engage a wide variety of communities with your interpretation? All questions to really consider. Why can't I move on? There we go. Sorry. And finally, program and exhibitions. So do your exhibitions attract a wide diversity of audiences? Are they targeted towards any specific audiences? Are they representative of modern Britain? Do you work with artists and activists of colour? And do you tend to work with the same groups of designers and artists you've always used? This is so important because it's often a pitfall of museums to think that if they just do an exhibition or a program, piece of work that targets a specific group of people, that specific group of people will come along, and it's that simple. But there is so much more engagement and activity needs to go alongside that, because Black people, for example, have been ignored by museums for so long in this country. Why do you think, if you're just going to do an exhibition about Black history in some way, that they're automatically going to want to come along when they've been excluded in terms of everything else? So there absolutely has to be this engagement work that goes alongside that. You have to identify the people you want to work with and make sure that you can actually involve them in the process to actually make it worthwhile. And one of the biggest questions I get asked is, why don't we understand Black history in this country? And there are a number of reasons for that, but I think within museums, these two images kind of sum that up. The two stories and narratives I tend to see regarding Black history in this country in museums usually are about racism, that image on the left, or slavery, the image on the right. And Black history is so much more than that. And we always, in museums, tend to focus on the pain and suffering of Black history, but it is so much wider, and I'm going to talk about that now. I've got some examples here, but Black British history goes so much further. It could be Mary Seacole, it could be the Bristol bus boycotts, it could be Black soldiers in the World Wars. It's stories of music, joy, survival, passion. It is more than the transatlantic slave trade. And we need to get away from that narrative of just thinking Black British history is this, it is suffering, it is overcoming the suffering, when there is so much more and there's so much richness to Black British history. And I just wanted to touch on some of the aspects of racism I've actually witnessed in museums and by museum staff. Which, you know, the first one I've touched on a bit before. The idea that by displaying racist objects, like in the previous image, you have explored Black history, when that's not true. You've explored. I put at the bottom. I consider racism to not be Black history. It's white history that burdens Black people and other people of color. Racism is not my history. It's not our history. It is the history of white people, because white people cause racism. Racism only exists because of white people. So it's not my history. I don't consider that Black history. But it's history that is often placed on Black history because it's something that white history doesn't want to acknowledge or talk about. I think that racism in museums also looks like not collecting objects from diverse communities, because whether you consider it intentional or not, what you don't collect says as much about your organization as what you do. The other one, obviously, is contentious with the restitution conversations, but knowing that you have illegally acquired objects and refusing to return them or engage with their source communities that might have a right to them. So obviously, the Arts Council is amongst other things, in the midst of drafting some new guidance on restitution and repatriation. If you know in your museum, though, that you have objects that you don't fully know where they came from, you don't know how they came to be, or you do know that they were acquired in a way that is not acceptable, and you're not doing anything about it, that's really worrying. That's really concerning, and you need to sort yourselves out. And then the other one is automatically assuming that objects are better off in your care. This one borders kind of dangerously close to white supremacy for me, I think, because a lot of museums often say, museum professionals often say, well, we don't want to send an object back to its origin country because they don't have the infrastructure or the knowledge to know how to take care of it. And that is a disgusting attitude, but it's one that is really prevalent. And you need to get rid of that attitude because it is not helpful to the discussion at all. And then I just wanted to touch on some statistics, because people love statistics, don't they? I want to talk about a creative case for diversity. This is Arts Council's model of measuring diversity and inclusion within the cultural sector. The latest set of statistics that we have for museums from the financial year 2019 to 20 show museums are performing really badly in terms of creative case for diversity. In fact, museums have the lowest paying workforce of all art forms at 6%. So 6% of their workforce is Black, Asian, minority, and ethnic, which obviously we can go into the acronyms of what that means, but basically that's not even just Black people in the museum or Asian people in the museum. That is minority and ethnic, which can include white European people. So they're white. So in terms of diversity, that's not really helpful at all. And the lowest LGBT workforce at 3% as well. So it's not just race that's a problem. There are other issues within museums as well. We have the highest level of not met ratings of 5%. And if I just explain what a not met rating is, it basically means that a museum has failed to meet their funding obligations to provide a diverse program for that year, which means that they're just not doing anything to encourage any diversity within their organization at all. So museums are failing at that as well. And we fund over 200 museums as national portfolio organizations in this country, which is a small snapshot of the over 1,300 accredited museums across the country. So it's not obviously a representative, fully representative model of how museums are faring in terms of diversity. But if they're the museums that are really being encouraged to do this, what about museums that are just not doing it at all, or just not be even thinking about it? And that's really worrying. So finally, just wanted to throw out some top tips. If you're looking for funding from Arts Council, from any other organizations to help do this work, and we really, really encourage you to do so, because this is what our money is for, just as much as any other bit of museum work. Include budget for anti-racist practice or decolonization within your projects. Spell it out, make it clear that this money is to do community work, to build networks, build relationships. You can even say you want to use that money just to feed people when they come in. If you have people if you're working with people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who might be giving up their spare time to work with you, give them some food, give them or pay them for their time, give them some money to make sure that it's worth their while. And to remember that you need those diverse communities more than they need you, more than anything, because museums continue to fail on this. And that's not the fault of people of color. That's not the fault of LGBT people. That's not the fault of, of anyone that's not embedded into a museum. That is the museum's fault themselves. I would say you need to speak up for those who can't and support your colleagues. So if there are people that aren't in the room that should be in the room having these discussions, say what they would say or ask them for their opinions. Support your colleagues that are trying to do this work. Make sure that they have a voice. Consider having a sensitivity check on your interpretation documentation. This is a really interesting idea because it's something that authors and writers are starting to do recently. Is when they're writing, they're trying to make sure that their writing is inoffensive to people. So they do a thing where they have a sensitivity check where basically they pay people from different communities to look over their writing, make sure that there's nothing that actually would be offensive. I think museums should definitely do that because they're not doing it right now and it's not working. Like I said, if anything you have in your collection is related to Black history or any BAME history is about racism, then that's not representative of that history. That is representative of a really horrible thing that exists in the world, but it's not talking about the benefits or the opportunities or the joy of being a person of color. And finally, you have more power and influence than you know, and you need to be the change because people of color can't keep holding this burden, basically. So if you're white and you work in museums, you should absolutely be doing this. And like Subhadra said, this should be a focus for you. So I'm going to end it there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Liam. And again, this is a very important topic that will be coming up in future seminar sessions, the idea of content and interpretation. And it's very easy for a lot of museums to kind of say, oh, we don't have the collections, or to kind of do tokenistic things, looking at only the negative aspects of not just looking at Black history, but looking at all sorts of topics and discrimination kind of throughout history. And it's very easy to look at the negatives, and actually we need to be celebrating and shouting those positives more importantly now than ever. So thank you, both of you. We do have some questions that have been coming through. So I will start off by asking them, and please feel free to jump in and answer whenever you feel like, if you can. So the first question is, how do we fight back censorship when we're threatened with losing our jobs or with disciplinary actions? A tough one. Anyone want to wade in?
I suppose I better give it, seeing I was like, you should lose your job if you can't be asked to do anything. Yeah, okay, so there are ways of getting messages across that don't outright contravene particular bits of legislation. And also do some advocacy work before you get words on a page. So when I did Bricks and Mortals, the exhibition, the podcast at UCL about eugenics, that obviously, it was done very quickly because it was done with a teeny tiny pot of money that happened to be left over at the end of the financial year. Sound familiar, anyone? But nonetheless, I had conversations with people around the university and within my department to make sure that they knew it was coming and knew what was happening and were on board. So it's not simply, yeah, if it's about my job description involves writing museum labels, and if I write the wrong label, I'll get fired. Yeah, you're more powerful than that. You are way more powerful than that. Also, there is research that you have done or your colleagues have done that is going into writing that label that supports the thing that you are writing. None of us are writing things that are false. And if it is the case that disciplinary action is taken against you, I'm pretty sure it's illegal to fire someone for telling the truth. But I'm not a legal expert, so I can't speak to that. Yeah, how's that for an answer? Is that helpful? I'm just mindful that Liam tends to give more measured and useful answers in this kind of situation, backed up with numbers and facts, to get angry and speak. But yeah, that's we can all do more.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I think that I'm really happy to admit, well, not happy, but I will admit that I used to be that person. When I first started working in museums and heritage, I was absolutely the guy that would play it safe, because I was like, I'm too junior. I do not want to lose my job. I'm going to just get by. And I have been really lucky to be in a position now where I can actually be more explicit and outwardly challenge some of these things. But I also got to a point earlier in my career, basically a year in, where I was like, actually, I don't care. It is not worth me pretending that everything is fine or hiding all this, because it is making me miserable. And if I want to actually thrive in this industry, I need to try and make the change. And that's what's kept me going more than anything else. So it is absolutely a logical concern to, and a good thing to not want to lose your job, because this economy sucks. But at the same time, if you don't challenge things, things will never change, will they? So that's the reality of it. I think you just got to be brave.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, and it, like you both, it's something I think we all, even not just junior, I think anyone at any level, it's the threat of losing the kind of your position that can often stop people from wanting to do anything at all, which is not particularly good. Next question is, bear with me. How do we use the show that some organizations and people are putting on, especially after this summer's Black Lives Matter movement protests and things, to force them to make real change? There's a lot of talk and not necessarily the follow through afterwards.
Subhadra, do you want to go, or shall I just
Please go
jump
ahead.
in? Holding institutions to account is tricky if you're not in a position of power within them. But like Subhadra was saying, there are ways to get points and messages across that don't have to seem like threats or like intimidation or anything like that. Often it's just like, actually, you have a right to talk to your leadership teams, to talk to your CEO, to talk to whoever runs the organization. If you have serious concerns about the direction that organization is going in, and if you think that it is, for example, in any way contravening diversity and equality legislation, all sorts of ways that you can hold people to account by that. The law is a powerful tool. It doesn't always work in our favor, but it is a powerful tool. So you can absolutely do that. Being aware of the law is really useful. I've certainly done that. Also, join a union. If you have a union, join a bloody union. They are there to support you and help you in these situations. I hadn't joined a union before, but earlier this year, I joined our union for the first time, and they have been so useful. They have helped me and supported me so much throughout all the discussions I've been having this year, because there have been some really, really tense, controversial discussions we've had. So yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Wonderful.
That is really powerful. I will second that. And yeah, it's about maneuvering, and it's kind of about understanding. I think this is what we're all up against, and I think I have a similar kind of thing, which is that at some point I just embraced the idea that everything that I had been taught was professional wasn't necessarily serving the cause in the way that it was supposed to be. Everything that I thought was professional, newsflash, in museums is about keeping things the same. So there, I'm sorry, I'm feeling this is just the emotion of the moment of the day, because I'm kind of wired, but and therefore feeling pessimistic about it. So I'm trying to fight that natural pessimism. At the very least, don't lose territory. So that is the thing about holding people to account, is that if senior management in organizations have issued Black Lives Matter statements and have said that they want to do things, there are ways to publicly hold them to account. And this is, and also, by the way, welcome to mine and Liam's world. We do this all the time, and we've been afraid for our jobs when we've done particular things. The thing to remember is that you're calling out racism within your organization is not the problem. Your organization being racist is a problem. And yes, the reason you feel vulnerable as an individual is because that is how the organization is set up, to silence dissenting voices. So find solidarity, find your people, join a union. There's more of us than there are of them. There really are.
Brilliant. Very good answers. Another question specifically aimed at Liam, but obviously kind of both of you can weigh in with this. Following the discussion at Museums 2020 today about a Black British History Museum, do you think this is the answer? Or sorry, there's some follow-ons as well. Or shouldn't rather all museums be encouraged and pressured to widen their own views and exhibitions on Black history as part of the whole? And how do we address curriculum changes in schools in relation to this?
I mean, I see it as a bit of both. I think what's really interesting is if you look at the American model of museums, they have their museums kind of more of a social focus as opposed to a theme. But often you'll get, for example, in Los Angeles, right, they have a Latin American museum, they have a Black museum, they have an African American museum, they have museums for different community groups based in those areas where the community groups live tend to gather. So that's an interesting model. I mean, obviously America has a whole history of segregation, so it might just be that evolved out of that. But at the same time, basically those places do provide a space for those communities to actually be engaged and feel safe, because they know it's going to be run by people that look like them, who act like them, who have the same kind of life experiences. So I think having a Black British Museum would be brilliant, and but only if it was fully led by Black people and able to be, a space for Black people to be safe and talk about history and talk about all the terrible stuff that continues to exist. But at the same time, that's not an excuse for other museums not to do that. And other museums absolutely should still make it a priority to try and serve all their communities, because that's the only reason they exist. That's the reason they get funding. That's what their goals are to do. And if you're not doing that, you're failing on your mission. So absolutely, you know, I would like about British Museum, but I also think all museums just need to be better.
Very good point.
Can't say anything else. Superb.
Fantastic. Another question. How do we celebrate and champion Black, Indian, Asian, Indigenous and people of colour's histories in our exhibitions and museums, whilst acknowledging and challenging our white colonial histories, which are triggering and traumatic history?
I mean, how much time do we have? Okay. So
9 minutes.
Okay. Right.
Or if there's maybe, I don't know, maybe if it's a long answer to this, are there any places we can go to look at ways in which other places have done such work? Are there any papers that are kind of covering this?
Oh, yeah. Or by all means, go to the Grant Museum at UCL, which is going to close tomorrow because of lockdown. But hopefully we'll make some content available online and look at our Displays of Power exhibition, which is all about the colonial context of University College London and natural history collecting. I don't know of any other natural history collections that have done anything similar. In point of fact, I'm pretty sure there aren't, because our whole point was that we were the first. Yeah, there are other examples from other subject areas. Liam, if you want to chip in with other examples, while I try and remember what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, in terms of the larger question, like, I think a key thing is getting over the idea that racism or race is a taboo subject. And a lot of the time it is in this country, but again, that's not something that comes from Black people. That's not something that comes from people of color. That comes from white people. It comes from the fact that white people don't want to talk about their own racism and their own problems. So it's up to you to get over that, and you've got to do that yourself. You've got to do the legwork for that. I can't solve that for you. And encourage your colleagues and other people you know to do the same. In terms of places to go where you can just look at things, you know, I guess I don't know if I don't think the exhibition is still there, but I was really struck. I'm quite surprised by St Albans Museum, which had a really great exhibition about science in St Albans. I'm pretty sure it was very much inspired and led by Farhana Begum, who works there. And she and well, the whole team, they did a brilliant exhibition where they talked about eugenics and actually called the eugenicists what they were, eugenicists and racists. And I don't think, you know, you can't be afraid of using those words just because it makes someone uncomfortable or just because it labels someone as a bad thing. You know, that's what they are. We talk about Hitler as a racist, we talk about Hitler as a Nazi, but why can't we talk about British people in that way when they absolutely were, and some still are? You know, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I again want to echo that, because that was a lot of the challenge. And again, we're kind of trained not to. My first drafts for Bricks and Mortals did not have the word racist in them. They barely had the word eugenics in them, which is kind of really contra the point. So yeah, call people by the thing that they are, and understand that you're not making a moral judgment about people in the past. What you're saying is that these individuals espoused, proliferated, compounded ideas to do with difference and hierarchy and white supremacy, because that is what they did. And when we call them by those names, that's not to say, you know, we're damning their souls to hell or speaking ill of the dead, which I think is some of the attitude involved in that. It's saying we are starting to acknowledge the frame of how their ideas fed into ideas of the past, but also ideas of the present. One caveat to that is, if you're worried about offending racists, stop. They are not the people that you want to worry about, but there are ways in which you can bring your message across in more meaningful ways.
Very good. Yeah. And I think this is the thing, we often kind of other the past and kind of think anything that is not kind of within our modern standards is kind of either excused as a, oh, it was in the past, that's fine.
Yeah, they were all racist back then.
Yeah,
they were.
Yeah, exactly.
But also they weren't. There were plenty of black people who weren't racists.
Yeah, and it's also the glorification of the people that are British, regardless of what they did. In some cases, not just British, but other countries do the same. It's this idea of, well, they were from our country, so even though they murdered hundreds of people, it was for a greater cause. But and as an archaeologist myself, I know it goes back way into the past, and we kind of try and cover those issues in Colchester museums in the kind of deep history, because it's not, as you said, it should be about Black history. It's not just about the history of slavery. This is about the existence of diversity within the past, which you go into most museums in the UK and it's just white middle class people, and that's not how it was, and that's not how it is now. So we need to change that. Another question, we've got a little bit of time left. So the museum, I'm not sure who this is from, someone says, the museum I used to work in didn't share some photos from the protests, I'm assuming from the protests in the summer, and then asked for posters from protesters afterwards, but has done nothing since.
Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah, it's not really a question, it's more of a statement, I think. But yeah, I think there's been a lot of reactionary kind of, as you kind of mentioned earlier, Subhadra, it's kind of reactionary nature of things, and it's difficult to look at. You see these kind of tokenistic gestures like taking down statues once another one's been toppled. It's like, well, that's all well and good, but that should have been done a long time ago if it was going to happen.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I mean, I'm probably going to swear again, but if you're collecting stuff and not doing anything with it, what the fuck are you doing? What is that for? Like, we don't want this stuff to just continue to rot in your storerooms like 95% of museum collections do. We need to actually see and engage with the material.
Yeah, definitely. I think the final question I will end on is, so we're very lucky to have had quite a lot of people watching today, and they will have been from a whole host of different organizations of different scales. And so how do you think this idea of scale and museums and how we engage with these topics can differ? Because I know obviously smaller museums, less funded museums might feel that they're less able to engage with the topic of decolonisation, and how we can kind of help support museums like that to be able to do this work.
I'm going to refer you back to how I finished my talk, which is that this is the work of every museum, regardless of the size it is. Museums were envisaged as colonial tools. It was where some of them, particularly the national museums, were where the great unwashed was supposed to come and be made clean and civilized by this interaction with culture and also the show of empire. So if you are a museum, you are a part of a colonial endeavor. That is the gist of it. And when it comes to size, again, it's to do with all of these questions that we've been talking about, which is like, how do you maneuver and how do you influence change? And I will again come back to say that you as an individual are more powerful than you think you are. You have a voice, use it. You have particular privileges. I am brown and I am female, which are identities that have been marginalized. But I am cis, I am straight, I am able-bodied. Or actually non-disabled is really the word I should use. So, you know, I'm trying to be aware of my privileges. Oh, I'm posh and I'm rich as well, by the way. That's not showing off. It was just just making sure that I noted those things. So yeah, we all have privileges that we can maneuver. Work it. Do something. Just do something, please. I'm tired. And encouraging you to do things. Thank you.
I very much agree with everything you said, Subhadra. But I'd also say that for any museums that think they have an excuse by saying that, you know, we can't get funding or we can't get the opportunities to do this, there are so many bloody museum groups in this country. It is unreal, more than any other country. And for the, you know, so not only do you have multiple funding streams that you can apply for, you have the museum development groups, which work all across the country. You have a museum development officer in each county. Each of those museum development groups offer micromanaged funds as well, so you can get small scale funding for different projects. So don't give me an excuse that you don't think that you can do this or that you can't get funding opportunities. It is there, you're just not doing it. It's up to you.
Perfect. And that is a good place to end on, I think. There is no excuse. We should all be doing this work, whatever level you are in a museum, whatever type of museum you're working. We can all be working towards this, and not just museums. This extends far beyond that. So I'd like to thank Subhadra and Liam for joining us today. It's been an absolutely incredible whirlwind tour of examples of work that's been going on, approaches that we can all be taking in our own organisations. We have, as I've said, we've got a series of seminars coming up now every week. We've been trying to alternate them from kind of these afternoon slots and evening slots, knowing that sometimes people aren't able to make either or because of kind of childcare provisions or other provisions that need to be made. So we're trying to kind of alternate those so that as many people can join into some of these sessions as possible. However, they will be posted onto our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you miss any of them, you will be able to see them afterwards. Although do bear with, this is the first time we've done this. It may be a while before it happens, but we will share that with everyone once we know that they're up on our YouTube channels. So remember, the conversations can continue on our social media. The hashtag is CultureDND. You will have seen Subhadra, Liam, and Colchester Museums all have our own Twitter handles. You can approach all of us. There's been a lot of activity on Twitter this afternoon, so it'll be good to see what people have been saying. But thank you all for joining us, and we'll end it there.